Black Doctors Podcast. Welcome back to Black Doctors Podcast. I am Steven, your host. So excited to bring you this episode. This is a culmination of 4 years. We're celebrating 4 years on the air. In June of 2020, I launched the Black Doctors Podcast. We've come a really, really long way since then. I've had so many incredible experiences. I've had the opportunity to meet so many people. And every year on the anniversary of the show, I like to do a State of the Pod episode where I can talk about the things that we've accomplished together with our community, how we've grown over the last year. I like to revisit the start, how we launch things, why I started the podcast. And just for people that, may not have been here from the beginning, I like to revisit that and also provide information for folks that may be looking to start a podcast as well. Something that you can find helpful or some actionable items as you think about building a platform of your own. This episode of the Black Doctors Podcast is sponsored by TrueLearn. TrueLearn Smart Banks combine high-quality exam-style practice questions to help you prepare for that incredibly important test you're about to take. They have question banks designed for the USMLE exams as well as for 9 different medical specialties. I used TrueLearn to prepare for American Board of Anesthesiology board exam. They also have question banks designed for allied health professionals such as nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Check out the show notes for a special discount code that'll help you save money when you sign up for one of their question banks. Test your best with TrueLearn, the data-driven approach to exam preparation. We'll start with introductions. I am Dr. Stephen Bradley. I am an anesthesiologist and critical care medicine physician. I currently practice in Florida. My medical training took me through the Howard University College of Medicine. I owe so much to that institution, the experiences that I had there, the friends and colleagues that I made were truly for life. And I highly recommend that institution if you're pursuing a degree in medicine. After Howard, I went to the University of Chicago Medical Center. That's where I did my residency training in anesthesiology. While I was in residency, I swore into the Navy. So I had a 4-year service commitment. I finished residency, then joined the Navy. I was stationed in Virginia for 4 years, completing my active duty service commitment. And then I went back to the University of Chicago for a 1-year fellowship in critical care medicine. And then started my quote unquote real attending job just about a year ago down in Florida. I was on active duty in the Navy. And if you know anything about military medicine, there's a lot of free time. I had a lot of time where I wasn't really engaged clinically, but I had to be there. We weren't a very busy hospital, but there was frequent 24-hour calls on the weekends, at least once, maybe twice a month, where I'd be in-house on the weekend. And I really thought about what can I do to make the best use of this time? Doing some research, doing some reading. I can only read so much. I said, what can I do to make an impact that's bigger than myself, perhaps bring in some additional financial support? And I looked at a couple of different options, but podcasting was what kind of popped out to me. I didn't know much about podcasting, but I had plenty of time to read about it. So I watched a lot of YouTube videos. I think Dr. Nee Darko, I always have to credit him. He posted talking about why every physician should be a podcaster. And I was like, this is a bit extreme. But I looked at some of the information, the materials that he had on his websites, and thought this could be something I'm interested in. My goal with the podcast was to provide a resource for people that were in my position, that I was in years ago when I was applying to medical school or thinking about it. And I didn't have a huge community. I didn't know any physicians. I didn't know how to get started in applying to medical school. And I wanted to build a resource that shows pre-medical students, that shows residents, that shows medical students, even attending physicians, that our stories as underrepresented in medicine minorities, so Black people, Black physicians, our stories are all surprisingly similar. We overcame a lot of the same obstacles. So that was my goal in starting the podcast. The other thing that was going on in 2020, you might remember, was the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think a lot of us had a lot of free time on our hands. Well, you were either super busy or you had a lot of downtime. A lot of folks segued into critical care medicine, or if you were in emergency medicine, you saw a lot of crazy stuff coming into the operating room. If you were in anesthesia or in surgery, it could have gone one of two ways. You're more busy, more clinically engaged, or you're less busy because the ORs weren't running. They weren't doing elective cases. In the military, it's a bit of a long story. I was supposed to deploy to New York on the hospital ship. If you remember, they sent two hospital ships, one to San Diego or LA, and one to New York. And I was supposed to go to New York on the hospital ship. We had some differences of opinions, myself and the military leadership on that, the military medical leadership. Some of the things that just weren't good ideas clinically, and I voiced my concerns until I was subsequently removed from that deployment. So I did not end up going to New York. I found myself on my couch, as the ship was pulling away. And then shortly thereafter, I actually was assigned to a unit going to Iraq, a subtle coincidence. But in the middle of this, I was at home, I had a lot of time, and I started doing all the research. It took me about a month, maybe 2 months to dig through how do you start a podcast? What's a hosting platform? What should I name the podcast? What format should it be? And I do have a background in music. For the last, couple of years before I started the podcast, I had been starting to get back into playing music and music production. So I had some of the hard skill set in terms of audio engineering and audio production. So I was able to put all of this together and then launch the podcast. I recorded several episodes, and then the day the first episode went live, I was actually in, I think, New Mexico at an Army base because I was preparing to deploy overseas. And I had to pay, I think, $45 for Wi-Fi for the time I was there. Or I think it was like $45 a week. So I had the Wi-Fi, logged on, uploaded the first episode. I was using Anchor, which was a Spotify company. It was free. And I used that hosting platform to upload the first episode. I thought it was going to be the next Joe Rogan, and it was going to be an incredible side hustle and make so much money. And then the reality set in. I was actually surprised because the first week or 2 weeks, I got 50 downloads on that first episode. It was insane to me that 50 people wanted to tune in and listen to the show. But it was very humble beginnings. It was very humbling. It's okay, there's really not that much money in podcasting. So, and I will say that as you think about, do I want to start a podcast? It is really a labor of love. And you may not get rich quick off of podcasting. I'll probably talk a little later about the financial aspect, but you really need to know why you're starting a podcast if you choose to do so. So that was in 2020. I initially was doing kind of random seasons. The seasons kind of are willy-nilly, just however I feel like, okay, usually it's like a 6-month thing. Then I'll just start a new season. But we are currently just finishing up season 9 of the podcast. It's kind of every 6 months, I'll just switch to a new season. And have had the opportunity to meet so many people. From that 50 downloads of the first week, we've now hit over 200,000 downloads of the podcast, which is incredible numbers, very humbling. And we average between 2,000 to 4,000 downloads a month for the podcast. Some months are busier and we'll get up to the 4,000 range. And then more recently, we've been hanging out about 2,000 episode downloads a month, which is still fantastic and incredible that so many people are reaching out and listening to the show and sharing it with people and hopefully helping people. I've had the opportunity to go to the Student National Medical Association conference for the last couple of years, and being there around so many bright young minds in the future of medicine and having people come up to me and say, oh, hey, I listened to podcasts. It's been such a rewarding experience that the finances are whatever. I'm a physician and I don't need the income from podcasting. So it's been nice to really think about why I am hosting the show and provide the maximum value and the best production quality possible. Very early on, when I realized that this wasn't the lucrative side hustle that I thought it was, I was faced with that decision. Do I keep podcasting, or what do I do to make money off of this? Or maybe it's not about the money. And within that first year, I really got away from the financial side. And I looked at, one, there's a lot of people helping. Like right when I'm starting to feel burnt out over podcasting, usually somebody reaches out randomly on Instagram or with a review of the podcast online. And they just say, hey, I really appreciate what you're doing. I listened to the episodes and it was very helpful. And this just gives me that motivation to keep going. Additionally, one of the benefits has been online presence and building kind of a brand authority in the podcast space. I've had several people that have contacted me or they'll hit me up and ask me questions about podcasting. They're thinking about starting a podcast. I've been able to share some of that knowledge that I've gained over the last couple of years with them. So it's been very rewarding in that aspect. So for the last 4 years, we have over 200 episodes of the show. We have over 200 episodes of the show. I've interviewed over 100 different guests from specialties ranging to orthopedic surgery, to neurosurgery, to anesthesia, internal medicine, pediatrics, psychiatry, PM&R. I've really been trying to make the rounds and always provide a diverse experience with regards to the specialty. I try to keep a 50-50 ratio of male to female guest. So I think all representation matters with regards to gender, to sexual identity. So I've been really working to kind of keep things spread out. Could not have done it by myself. I do have to thank Dr. Nate Jones, who's been a very helpful supporter and co-host of the podcast. He's really been the backbone of kind of providing more structure because I'm a pretty laid back procrastinator for one, and I just make things up as I go along. So Nate, he's a pediatric emergency medicine physician. He came along and really helped provide some structure to the podcast. We have several guests that continue to come on and support the show, actually very high profile, incredibly renowned guest like Dr. Bianca Bush. She is a child and adolescent psychiatrist and the college psychiatrist. She's got a presence online and a niche audience or niche patient population that she's targeting. I met Dr. Bush. We were co-residents in Chicago. So we worked together for a couple of years, and she's been a fantastic friend and source of really useful information within her specialty. Dr. Kevin Simon has been a recurring guest as well. He's a psychiatrist in Boston. And I have to shout out to Dr. Italo Brown. He is an emergency medicine physician in California. And Italo, he speaks all over the place on diversity, equity, and inclusion and healthcare disparities. He's a phenomenal clinician, and he's on TV shows, you name it. But he'll see some things and he'll hit me up and be like, hey, man, we should talk about this on the podcast. And we talked last year about different topics like unilateral DNRs and people that have English as a second language, different topics like DEI and some of the healthcare legislation and healthcare disparities. And he's always available and brings his expertise to the show. So definitely appreciate those recurring guests. And of course, every guest that I have on the show is incredibly inspiring. And I'm unable to pay people to come on the show, but they come on and share their life story. We're usually able to talk about whatever kind of side projects they have going on, but they selflessly come on the show and provide content for the listener, provide inspiration to whoever's out there listening so selflessly. And so I appreciate each and every one of them. In the last year, we've had partnerships with groups like organizations like Tour for Diversity in Medicine. Got to partner with them and have several of their faculty members and leadership come on the podcast and share their vision. We did donate some money to Tour for Diversity Medicine. We've partnered with SNMA. We're supporting them and sharing information about their 60th anniversary, which was this past spring. And always love to feature guests from the Student National Medical Association. And we actually had a full page ad in the conference booklet this year. So that was pretty cool to do. And I always try to highlight different themes or different things that we should be supporting as a community of Black physicians. So if we want to look behind the scenes, so for people that are thinking about podcasting, I say first you need to decide on your mission, find your why. What is the purpose of you getting on the air, recording, editing, or having somebody edit? Because it is either a labor, of love, or it could be a moderate financial impact. But whatever you have to say needs to be that important. For most people that I've spoken to, I recommend more limited series type shows where you can record maybe 6 or 8 or 12 episodes, and maybe it's not a continuously running serial type podcast because that can get a little stale. And, I do work to try to keep information fresh. But one, you need to find your why. What do you want to talk about? And then be specific. As I was looking for different names, there's a lot of different affinity groups in medicine. And I thought about different names, but I wanted to be intentional about who my target audience was. And so hence the name, the Black Doctors Podcast, because that's really what I'm here to provide representation to, and to be able to corner this segment of the physician marketplace, the pre-med, the medical student marketplace, and talk about issues that are relevant to this community. Obviously, it is open to all comers, and I think everybody can learn a lot from the podcast. And there is actually a diverse range of listeners. We have a lot of listeners from Sweden, a lot of downloads in Sweden. That's always a nice surprise when I get the metrics. So find your why, know your target audience. You need to figure out who am I speaking to, and then don't deviate from that. People talk about, what makes a good podcast, or how do you know you're successful as a podcaster? And you, depending on the topic, that will tell you how big of an audience you're speaking to. Finance podcasts do really well. You can look at like Joe Rogan, for example, and the target audience that he's reaching is a huge swath of listeners. A lot of people would tune into the Joe Rogan podcast. The market for the Black Doctors Podcast is very niche and it's smaller. One of the examples when I was researching this is if you're doing a podcast for black bird watchers in the Northeast, you're probably targeting, 100, 1,000 people. So if your podcast listenership ends up being 100 or 1,000 people a week, you may have reached 100% of your target market. Now, you'll never reach numbers like the big name podcast shows, but for what you set out to do, you have completed that mission. So you really have to run your own race and know what you're trying to accomplish when you set out to build a show. But that's the same you would do for social media. If you're on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, all those, it's very similar, where you can't just produce content for everybody. You can, but it's probably better that you find a niche and people will come to you for that niche. So that's what I've tried to do with this podcast. Once you know your target audience, you know the name of your podcast, you have to do a couple of things. You have to get some recording equipment. It's probably best you get a standalone microphone. You can record directly into your computer. You don't necessarily need an audio interface, but it's nice to have a standalone microphone. Starting out, you don't necessarily need to do a video podcast. It may be useful to record video, which you can do from your laptop computer, FaceTime camera, or you can use your phone. There's a lot of apps that can record from the phone as well. So, and you can use those for media in the future. It's important that when you record, like you want to record multiple tracks. So if you have a second guest, you want to record 2 tracks, which means that the voices are on 2 separate audio recordings. Essentially, it's like 2 different tapes. That way you can adjust and edit both of those voices independently. You'll see, if you look at the very early episodes of the podcast, I was still really learning how to do the audio editing. And so sometimes I got it wrong. My voice was too low in some areas. The guests were too high or too low. It's a lot of dynamics that you'll learn over time. If you're doing your own editing, you can also outsource the editing to different groups. You can find people on Fiverr that will do the audio editing for the podcast. Some people get hung up on removing all of the verbal clutter, the ums and the ahs and the filler words. There's apps. I use the Descript app right now to edit some of those out. I don't try to get all of them out because we don't talk perfectly, but I do try to make myself and the guest sound fairly reasonably intelligent. And if it's bad verbal clutter or a lot of ums or stuttering or people misspeak, I do some post-production editing for that. So once you've recorded your podcast episode, you'll do some editing. I take the audio, I pay for a monthly subscription to Descript, which is a text-based editor that I can use. I also use some audio editing software, Isotope RX. That one's pretty pricey, but I use it for multiple applications, like when I'm doing music or stuff. So I wouldn't recommend that one for if you're just kind of jumping out in the podcasting world. But that one is helpful to remove some of the audio imperfections. There's this thing, the bane of my existence is sibilance. I think it's my mic, honestly, but sibilance is like that really S sound that you hear when people are talking. And I do my best to edit that out. But I'm still learning. So a lot of time spent on YouTube to figure out how to edit the audio. Once you get it edited, I can take the transcript. Like when I first started back 4 years ago, AI really wasn't what it was today. So there's always separate standalone products that's like, hey, if you want a transcript, you got to pay somebody to transcribe your podcast episode. Or you could do it digitally, but you had to pay for every like minute. It was like X amount of cents per minute to transcribe. As AI tools got better over the 4 years, it's been fantastic to see that all that stuff just gets bundled into one. So with my text-based editor, Descript, I can edit the audio. I have a transcript. I'm editing from the transcript. And at the end, I can say, create show notes, and it's going to summarize what I've said and create the show notes that will go into the podcast. So you'll choose a hosting platform. The big ones are like Buzzsprout or Libsyn. I use Acast. I think there's an affiliate link maybe in the show notes. And you upload it there. You upload your text. You can upload album art, which I use Canva, or I use the Adobe version of Canva, which I think is like Spark, something like that. Upload your album art, and boom, you have your podcast online. If you want to launch a podcast, you got to put like a trailer up 3 days before you want to launch your first episode, because there is a 3 to 5 day delay for your podcast to show up on all of the different hosting platforms. Some of the broader metrics for podcasts, I think there was like, it's like a total, it's incredible the number of podcasts that are out there, but the number of active podcasts is like 10% of all podcasts that have been created. There's incredible statistics on Podfade, and so many podcasts that have started, like the majority of them have 1 or 2 episodes. So if you make it a month or make it through 6 episodes or your limited series, you're probably doing better than most podcasts that are out there. So where do we go from here? Some of the future goals of the podcast. Currently, it's still pretty much a one-man show. I do the scheduling. I record episodes. Occasionally, I'll have Dr. Jones. He comes on and he'll record some episodes as well. But I record episodes, and then it's usually about Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening that I am furiously editing the podcast episodes and trying to get them uploaded in time. It probably takes me anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour to edit a podcast episode. There's a lot of tools that I have, again, that have made it much more simple to do. The goals over the next couple of years is to get some more sponsors. I've had probably 5 or 6 sponsors over the 4 years or so that the show's been out. Anybody from Clove, they make sneakers for healthcare workers. They sponsored us for a while. We had a deal with Good RX. Picmonic and TrueLearn, they really came in and held us down. TrueLearn's actually back to continue supporting the show. And again, all this money helps the show to grow. And then a lot of it ends up going back out to different listeners and supporting different organizations. Because again, I don't financially need the money, but it's nice to not be in the red when it comes to labors of love. So definitely appreciate TrueLearn for supporting the show at the beginning of this episode as well. Who else? Michael Johnson Legal. He has provided some money and some sponsorships. And when he comes on the show, it's been incredibly valuable because he just shares so much information about the legal side of medicine and contracting. And that's been some of the best received episodes because, again, it's very applicable and very helpful to listeners. So definitely thank him for his support. And there's definitely some others. But in the next, couple of years, I'll keep looking and reaching out to different sponsors. If you want to sponsor the show, you can reach out as well. We can talk. I think over the life of the show, I've probably made or grossed, $10,000, maybe 10 or 11,000 over the 4 years. That's probably close to net even with the 4 years of paying for hosting platforms, buying equipment, buying editing. The editing software was pretty expensive. What else? We have been able to donate quite a bit to different organizations and even directly to students that are transitioning to medical school or to residency. A lot of this is just limited by the time that I have to build out the infrastructure on the website to find applicants for different scholarship programs or whatever. So hopefully, as I get my life together more organized, I'm going to be able to branch out. I really am not great at multitasking, but I need to get better at that. So that's the financials of the show. So if I'd streamlined it, I could probably make more money. But again, I don't know. I'm happy it's working out for now. We'll see where we go in the future. One of the big things is going to start this month in June. So I really want to be able to talk directly to patients. It's nice, on social media and on Twitter and all that we have these groups for Black physicians or med Twitter or the humor, all that stuff. We have these insular communities, though, physicians, and I really want to reach directly out to patients, communities that look like us. And so once a month, I'll be doing the Black Doctors Community Podcast. It'll be a separate standalone podcast episode, but hosted on this show. And it's going to be an episode that you can share with your family, with your friends that are not in medicine. That's the goal. So I'll talk about basic healthcare information, not medical advice, but healthcare information. I'm just a simple country anesthesiologist, a critical care physician, but I do want to provide some actionable information. What can patients expect when they're coming to the hospital for surgery? What do they need to know about pediatric medicine and raising healthy kids? What do people need to know about mental health? How do they get plugged in with a psychiatrist? Information like that. And I'll plan on doing one of those a month, 30 to 45-minute episode that can be helpful to the community. So tune in for that, and I would appreciate you sharing with your community, sharing with your network, people and family members that you think can benefit from that health-related information. I could have probably said this earlier. We are an award-winning show. So I think 2 years ago, won an award with the Signal Award for podcasting. We got second place for health and fitness-related podcast. It's over there on the shelf, actually. Let me grab it. So we are an award-winning podcast. Back in 2022, we won the Signal Awards. So it's a silver winner for the category of health and wellness. There's the award. If you're watching on video, it's probably a clip that I'll put on social media. So we won this. Now, I think we also won an award with the Black Podcasters Association, I think. And that's great. I don't know that we'll win any additional awards. The reason being, like, a lot of these lists are kind of scams. Full transparency. I mean, I feel like I've been pretty transparent this whole episode. A lot of these, lists are scams. Like, I've gotten emails that, do you want to be on the list of top doctors for Tampa Bay, top anesthesiologists, and then invariably you got to pay them a fee to be on this list. And it's not much different with these podcasting awards so far. Or maybe I haven't found the awards that just look at your podcast for content and say, hey, you've got a really good podcast. We're going to give you a prize. So far, essentially it's, I want to make some money. So I want to make a podcast award, and I'm going to market to all the podcasts. And if you pay X amount of dollars, it was like, I don't know, $150, $200 or something per category that I wanted to enter. So I paid, that's where some of the money went from the $10,000 that the show made. So I paid money, entered the podcast award competition, and we won. Yay. That's awesome. I got a nice trophy. I think the trophy was like $150 too. So I don't know, I probably need a financial planner to help with the financial decisions for this podcast. That's all I have to say. It's been great. We won an award. That's cool. But for me, it wasn't the validation that I needed. And I don't think it is really worthwhile to continue to pay to be in these different markets, to be in these different award programs, because I don't know, it doesn't really speak to the listeners that I have. My satisfaction comes from knowing that I've reached that pre-medical student that was lost and didn't know that they could become an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And they heard Dr. El Tahir's story, and now they have a new goal in life and a new specialty desire. So you may not see any more awards won by the Black Doctors Podcast. Maybe I should start my own awards program. But regardless, the best thing that you can do if you want to help support the show, sharing this podcast with people that you think it'll be helpful for, leaving reviews. I think we're up to 100 reviews on Apple Podcasts. Again, blown away. This project has grown in ways I would have never imagined. And I'm so thankful for you all and for your support. For the rest of the month, I'm actually doing something different in that it's going to be a bunch of solo episodes. Spoiler alert, if you can't stand the sound of my voice, you can stop listening now. For the last 4 years, I really don't like being the center of attention. I am a role player. I'm your number two guy. I'm really supportive. But I saw a need that I thought needed to be filled. That's why I started the podcast. I've had the benefit of hiding behind the guests that I have on the show most of the time, and I don't have to be centered in front of the spotlight. This month, I'm challenging myself to get out there to share my stories. I've had people in Need Darko, other people have said, hey, you should share more about your story. I was talking to Adam Milan, one of my good friends. He's been on the show before, and he was like, you really got this work-life balance thing figured out. You should talk about that. So the rest of the month of June, there'll be some episodes. I'll talk about my time in military medicine. I'll probably finally share the story of how I got kicked off of a deployment, kind of go through the details of that. I'll talk about my philosophy for finding happiness and living a balanced life in healthcare as a physician, as a medical student resident. And really excited to share my entire story of how I came into medicine. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a wild journey. It's been a long journey, 4 years of the Black Doctors Podcast. Thank you for your support. Tune in next week. We're here because representation matters.